hub,
and spoke. Audio Collective.
Commercial Type is now shipping Double Accent Pop, our first comprehensive type specimen in nearly a decade, featuring our full library in a compact paperback format. This book is intended for reading as much as it is for looking at type, with an essay by writer Molly Lambert exploring why some of the most iconic duos in pop music history flourished or flopped. Workshop's founder Chris Wu had free reign on the design, giving each thread its own layout and showcasing the entire Commercial Type library. The specimen is a buoyant fusion of content and form, irreverent, opinionated, and exhilarating. Find it now at commercialtype.com.
While many printers have shifted their focus, Freeport Press has remained committed to the art of print. For companies that need a printing partner for magazines, look no further than Freeport Press. We offer the capabilities a customer would expect from a national printer while offering the level of customer service clients expect from a family-owned business. Freeport Press. We do print, and we do it well.
freeportpress.com.
I may be completely wrong and naive about this, but I think you work for a big organization, you trade your freedom of action for the access to massive resources. Whereas on a smaller publication, you have a lot more theoretical freedom of action, but the range of resources is much more limited and you have to sometimes work quite hard to preserve them. But, both these things are interesting. I've just ended up working in smaller, hopefully feistier things.
This is Print is Dead, Long Live Print, a podcast about magazines and the people who made and make them. I'm Deborah Bishop.
I'm Patrick Mitchell. Simon Esterson is one of the most influential figures in British magazine design, shaping the field for decades with his distinctive approach to editorial work. Unlike many designers who built their careers within major publishing houses, Esterson chose a different path, gravitating toward independent publishing, where his influence could be greater and his contributions more impactful. This decision allowed him to play a key role in fostering a rich culture of design-led publications. His early work at Blueprint, the legendary British design and architecture magazine, set the stage for a career that would lead him to The Guardian, the Sunday Times of London, and the Italian architecture magazine Domus, before establishing his own London-based studio, Esterson Associates. Today, Esterson's most visible project is the internationally renowned journal of graphic design. As its art director and co-owner, he has been instrumental in maintaining its reputation as one of the most essential platforms for design professionals. Thanks to his non-stop editorial work, Esterson is widely considered to be a mentor and role model for generations of British designers, proving that great editorial design does not require vast resources, but rather a clear vision and an understanding of how design can elevate content. That's what great designers do. Simon, you did not train to become a magazine designer. You told me you learned on the job. Can you talk about how you landed in the publishing world?
I did the school magazine, and I think I originally wanted to be a journalist. My best friend who sat next to me at school turned out to be a much better writer and journalist than I was ever going to be. But there was nobody who put the school magazine together. There was a printer who put the school magazine together when we first arrived, and it was like, single column, wide measure, monotype set, Bembo. So it was basically a book with subheadings. We had a very keen master, as we called him in our school, master looking after the magazine. And he said, well, I think we should change the format. And we changed it to a magazine format. Suddenly the printer needed help. So I just began marrying up words and pictures and drawings and learning about column setting. When I didn't know how to do something, I'd go and ask the printer. I was quite young and he had a little type specimen book. And I said, I'd like to set the whole magazine in univers. And he said, oh, well, we've only got 9 point and 12 point. And I said, I'd like some bigger type than that. And he said, well, I think you can rent the matrices from Monotype. So really from quite an early age, I was already discovering how far you could twist a brief and work with your supply chain to get bigger type or something. It was all set in metal. So when we started messing around with the layouts, and having some kind of house style for the typesetting, the galley proofs that came back were just covered in corrections. The author's correction bill was humongous. And I think I might have been the first pupil to actually have a conversation with the bursar. That's the guy who looks after the money in our school. And I got a message to go and see the bursar. And he said, "We've got the bill here for the latest issue of the school magazine, which I gather you're responsible for. Why is it twice the normal bill?" And I said, that's what happens when you have graphic design.
Fucking designers.
Yeah.
If you look at it from 30,000 feet and you're looking at little Simon, what would you say enthralled him/you about this world of magazine design?
Well, the journalistic bit, explaining things, understanding things, communicating things, and the magazine, that was the thing we had to do it with. And I suppose I realized that making a magazine was more than just the writing. It was the writing and how you framed it and how you presented it and what you put with it and how you made it. I just became, to the detriment of all my school studies, I was completely terrible. I became fascinated by how you do that. Before we were let loose with the school magazine, my friend and I had a little magazine we made, sort of classroom magazine that we made, which was called The Publication. I had a little stencil duplicator thing somewhere between some office contraption and a silk screen machine. And I would type the stencils. You had to type really hard because there were these sort of wax stencils. You put them on your screen and then ink went through it and you made a very splodgy. It looked like you were making a magazine about the communist revolution in 1917. It had that aesthetic.
Leaflets, yeah.
Exactly. It was Samizdat or something.
Let's go back to the beginning. You were born, can I say, 1958.
Yeah.
Chelmsford, Essex.
Yes.
Your dad was Maurice and your mom was Valerie. Were your parents creative?
Yes, they were. My mother was a teacher with a sideline in an interest in dance and kind of amateur theatricals and dance. As a teacher, she made all her own teaching materials. And I remember, just before the end of the school holidays, she'd be sitting in the kitchen with some crayons and cards, making flashcards for spelling tests and things. And she'd make them and then put that sort of plastic laminate on top of them. She drew really well and was, interested in nature and art and things. My father was an electrical engineer. And my mother wouldn't marry my father until he could recognize and name a number of plants and trees when they went for a walk. She was very worried that he wasn't very good at nature. So he worked really hard. And then he actually, I think rather against his better judgment, got himself into the local amateur dramatic company simply so that he could invite my mother out on a date. In the background, there was sort of the school stuff and drawing and my mother doing odd little bits of, choreography. At one point, I started doing little theatre programs for the local theatre group. There was a general atmosphere. Art was part of it. But I have to say, I can't draw. I think there was a sense in the house that art was part of what was going on, but I would occupy a rather extreme edge of it, I think. I became interested in books and magazines.
But was there a eureka moment when you realized, I know I'm good at something. I know I'm good at design or I'm good at art.
There was a eureka moment when I realized that I actually wasn't any good at anything else, which is kind of the opposite, really. My uncle had a little hand letterpress press. I used to see that when we went to visit him, and I was kind of fascinated by it. If my mother was a kind of front of stage person, amateur dramatics and dance and things, her brother, my uncle, was a backstage guy. And when they were young, would make little toy theatres and work out the lighting directions. And so he went into commercial television. And one of the things he did was design television studios and the equipment in them, and pioneered things like outside broadcast units and things like that. They lived in London, very, very glamorous. Chelmsford was, it's a county town and people sold cows and sheep in the market. But London was very glamorous. And when we went to see my uncle, they had a fondue set and they had that sort of sophisticated ladder axe shelving system, which was very popular then and is popular all over again. And amongst the things he had was his letterpress press. And he used to get Welcome Aboard, which was the in-flight magazine when the airline was still called BOAC. Rather excitingly, he looked after the printing aspects of the printing work that the television company did. I remember him telling me one day how they were launching something and they were printing a colour brochure, and that the printer actually sent a running sheet from the factory in Kent to his house in London for him to approve. This arrived at midnight and it had to be looked at straight away. It all sounded rather interesting to me. I was given a printing press and a bit of type, and I just started experimenting and learning about people's ideas of layout. And I decided I didn't like centered typography. I liked range left typography. And the more I read about Swiss design, modernist design, the more I was kind of interested in that. So I suppose it's kind of two different routes. One is a kind of Swiss modernist typography, and the other is a kind of American magazine design, which I think is a very different thing.
At what point in your life is this? Like what age?
I had the printing press when I was about 12.
Mm-hmm. Then did you decide to go to art school?
I went to a sort of proper school, gentlemanly school. I don't think any pupil had ever gone on to be a graphic designer. And when I announced that I was interested in design, everybody said, well, that's really interesting, Simon. What you should do is you should go to university and train to be a manager of a printing works. I said, I don't want to be the manager. I want to be a graphic designer. And they said, well, it's very interesting, Simon. You should go and learn how to make the chemistry of printing ink. And I said, I don't want to do that. I think it was a really good school. I treated it very badly, but it was a very good school. And of course, the key advantage was that it had a school magazine and a little printing club. And those were the things I sort of played with.
A printing club?
Yeah. And where this whole podcast will be me as a slightly enthusiastic, inky-fingered schoolboy.
Okay. I think it's amazing. So what we're saying is you went as a teenager kind of apprentice, so you went straight into...
I failed my A-levels really badly. That's the exams you take in the UK before you go to university. I did really, really badly, and I had one of those conversations you have with your father where he was very measured and very quiet, and basically said in the nicest possible way, I think you need to get a job, Simon. And I found a job working in one of the really early instant print shops in the UK. And it was in London and it was non-unionized. So the staff were a mixture of rather old lag printers who had sort of fallen out with the union for some reason, and young people, some from university, some from the art college. We had Xerox machines and litho machines, and we used to letraset like mad for stuff, and we had IBM composing machines, and it was just like a sort of playground. But it was a playground with drugs and customers thrown in.
I was going to say it was like a porn shop.
It was quite a learning process.
Well, I want to fast forward now to the design scene. At that time, maybe it was the 80s or a little bit later?
Yes, it's 1976 or something, that sort of time, yeah.
So what was that like?
Well, when I eventually got to work on a magazine, which was a place called the Architectural Press, which was a family-owned publishing company, and we had the Architects Journal, which was a weekly magazine for architects circulating in the UK. And we had the Architectural Review, which was an international monthly architecture magazine. And the Architects Journal earned all the money, and the Architectural Review spent it all. I was definitely in the sort of functional bit, and I was lucky that I went there as the assistant art editor.
It sounds official.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really simple job. Just take the galley proofs, paste up these back of the book pages. But then the art editor left quite soon afterwards to go to some sprawny new magazine launch. And I was very lucky. The then production editor said, oh, I think Simon can probably do this. Why don't we try letting him be in charge? So I was 20 years old and was art editor of 120 editorial pages a week, with an assistant, with a subbing room of 4 people taking the layouts, because it was all not paste up in the sense we know, but just assembly, markup, goes off to the printer, gets made up, you see a page proof, all that stuff. So that's what I was doing.
Well, what was it like?
For a period, I was actually commuting from Chelmsford, where I was living, where I was born, and that was like a 45-minute commute into London.
You weren't out slam dancing?
No, not really. Working for the print shop, that was, Friday night, we'd all be out at the French restaurant in the corner drinking till I missed my last train home, basically. At the architectural press, it was a bit more organized. Most people at the architectural press were responsible adults, so they had other things to do. And I was vaguely conscious of the bigger design scene, but, doing a weekly was quite an absorbing thing, really.
So, Simon, we've learned without our research too, because we just know that you are a hero to many young British designers. There's a unanimous sentiment among them that you are one of the most important designers in the UK. And there's also a unanimous sentiment that you're absolutely terrible at marketing and talking about yourself.
Yes, well, that last bit's true. I don't know about the first bit.
Self-promotion. I know. It's not a very British thing anyway. But I wanted to talk about your early magazine design heroes. We talked about some of the lesser-known British designers that our listeners may not know about but should. So let's talk about the three Davids.
The three Davids, yes. So, and they're all roughly contemporary in terms of when they were working. So we have David King. So David King worked initially at the Sunday Times magazine. The Sunday Times magazine was the first English colour magazine, free on a Sunday with your Sunday Times. And quite rapidly, the Sunday Times magazine developed under Michael Rand, who was the art director. David King was his sort of lead designer, and they had tough stories. They were the people who published Don McCullen's Pictures from Vietnam. Lots of gritty black and white special issues, really smart writing and really smart design, which pretty much continued until a certain period, probably in the early 80s, where the general feeling was that the advertisers began to complain that they didn't really want their glossy colour adverts next to pictures of starving children. That was really a little bit too real for them. And of course, by that time, all the other magazines, The Observer, The Telegraph, all those magazines had published as well. So the Sunday Times magazine had competition. And when advertisers said, we might go somewhere else, well, you can imagine how that changed editorial policy. So David King left the Sunday Times and became politically quite engaged. And there's a whole set of posters about apartheid in South Africa, about other political causes, which he designed in his big Franklin Gothic, heavy rule, black and red, simple colour, quite crude reproduction. And in a way, David defined the left-wing graphic style in the UK. That's David 1. David 2 is David Hillman. He worked at the Sunday Times magazine briefly as well. He's probably most famous for doing Nova. Nova was like the trendy women's magazine covers talking about stuff that the more mainstream women's, there were very few recipes. There were cookery articles, but,
Sexual revolution stuff.
That sort of stuff,
Yeah.
And very strong fashion photography, particularly by Peter Knapp and Harry Pecinotti. And then David went off to be a partner in Pentagram. And the third David is David Driver, who in a way was dealing with much more mainstream media. The main thing he did was that the BBC, British Broadcasting Corporation, had this kind of antique thing called the Radio Times, which was the magazine owned by the BBC, which published all the listings of what was going to be on the radio. And at that point, the listings were copyright, so nobody else could publish them, right? And then Colour arrived. And of course, you wouldn't change the name, it's so famous, but the BBC Radio Times didn't really know how to address colour, pictures even. And so they employed a publishing consultancy, a guy called Geoffrey Cannon, who was an editor, and David Driver, who was the art director, to come in and redesign the Radio Times. This was the biggest selling magazine in the United Kingdom. The Christmas issue sold, a squillion copies and was on press for 2 weeks or something. David and Geoffrey completely revolutionized the Radio Times. If you look at it now, you realize they knew about the International Herald Tribune and New York Magazine. You can tell, it's, swashy R, swashy T, Radio Times, but beautifully done. And David Driver, who began as an illustrator, is a brilliant commissioning art director. The Radio Times already had a tradition of illustration, and David just kind of lifted it. And so the best editorial illustration in Britain was in the Radio Times every week. And David then, after a while, became assistant deputy editor of the Radio Times. So he kind of moved from design into editorial, and then he went to be art director of the Times. That's the three Davids.
You did a beautiful book about David King's career and his work.
Yes, with Rick Poynter.
Yeah, and we'll link to that to make sure people can still get a copy.
We'll be right back.
Hi, this is Jeremy Leslie at Mag Culture. We're proud to support the Print is Dead podcast because we love magazines too. Visit magculture.com and see why print is far from over. It's just getting started. Read the journal for interviews and reviews, listen to our podcasts, visit our shop in London and online, and come to our live events in London and New York. We love magazines. Subscribe to our newsletter for weekly updates, all at magculture.com.
Well, you've called yourself a magaholic, but I'm not sure that that's the same as a workaholic. But I'm certainly a workaholic, and I think Patrick probably is too. Your wife is Jane, and you have two boys who have now gone into creative fields. Have you always worked round the clock? How do you get your balance? I'm always asked this question.
Yeah, it's very difficult. I've always been attracted to the idea that a magazine is the product itself. We're not making a box, however beautiful the box is, to put something else in. This is the thing. Okay. And I like that relationship. And also with newspapers and magazines, pretty much the only thing that stops you is the deadline, isn't it? It's got to be ready to be shipped. Okay. Otherwise, they can take any amount of effort and thought and rethought. I find it quite exciting if something seems possible. Oh, could we do that 16-page section 20 minutes before we go to press? Because that way we could get the picture from the person that's just taken it. I'm afraid I'm a kind of sucker, romantic, deluded fool about all that stuff. And yeah, so I'm quite often around.
The family has worked around it.
In a very wonderful way, yes. Jane is my first and only wife.
First and last.
Well, let's just say only at this point.
Yeah. All right. It's time to talk about magazines. I want to talk about Blueprint, which was a really big deal. I remember in the 80s, it was so cool. You could only find this at an international newsstand. And if you could find a copy of Blueprint, usually on the top shelf because it was so oversized,
yeah,
it was a major score. So talk about the Blueprint story and how you came together with that magazine.
Sure. So Dan Sujic was the first editor, and I knew Dan because he had worked in the news team at the Architects Journal. And then he'd gone on to be the architecture correspondent at the Sunday Times. And Peter Murray, who was the publisher, was actually the publisher of the Royal Institute of British Architects magazines. They had a monthly magazine. They, in between them, realized that actually, the kind of conventional architectural media, which was about architects building buildings, hospitals, schools, office blocks, and even things with property developers, that somehow that world, which had seemed very separate in the 50s and 60s, was completely merging with the world of interior designers who might be architects, might not be architects, with product designers and with graphic designers. You have a figure like Philippe Starck, the French hyphenate, who was on the cover of an early issue of Blueprint. Philippe Starck would design buildings, would design interiors, would design lemon squeezers, and he's still doing stuff now. You get your super yacht designed by Philippe Starck or Philippe Starck's team. And there wasn't really a magazine doing that, covering it in that way. So that was the idea behind Blueprint. We all had proper jobs, so we'd get together in a borrowed studio once a month and sort of bring stuff together. Dan would have had copy, which we would have had typeset already. I would probably commission some pictures to be taken. We worked a lot with a photographer called Philip Sayer, who I'd worked with for a very long time. And Philip and I would go through what we had, and he'd go off and take some portraits and do some stuff. And we'd bring stuff together. So on a Saturday morning, we'd all sort of get together. Odd writers would drop by with things. It was very jolly. It would be exceptionally jolly because we'd all go off to Saturday lunch and have something to drink. Everybody would go home except me and the design team, and we would start putting it together. Jan would write some headlines. And I worked with a guy called Stephen Coates, who shares the studio with us. Nigel Billen, who was a friend of mine, a couple of friends, and we do physical paste up. Actually, scalpels out, stick it all down, put in the positionals for the pictures, and we would work through Saturday night into Sunday afternoon. And we're talking about large format, 48 pages, some of them in colour. And basically the idea was that on Monday evening, we'd get together again and it would be checked Diane would check things, Peter the publisher would check things, and we'd ship on the Monday night. The sort of threat was that if we hadn't finished by Monday night, Peter the publisher would start letter setting. And so that was the threat. If you didn't finish it, somebody would finish it for you. And that was how it worked. And I was allowed to continue. The architectural press were quite happy for me to do this. They knew I was doing it because they thought it was a nice, interesting little independent thing. And then we actually started selling ads and getting rather successful, and people talked about the magazine. And then the architectural press quite understandably said, Simon, I think you need to choose between being art editor of the Architect's Journal and working on this magazine. I chose to go and work on Blueprint, and we had a little studio. Peter found a building that was about to be knocked down in Marylebone High Street in London, and we moved in and we just started making a magazine sort of properly. I mean, I had freelance work. I would do freelance work there. Everybody else had things going on. Diane would disappear for a few days and would arrive quite often in the evening from Barcelona or Berlin or America saying, oh, I just bumped into Doug Tompkins. Here's all the pictures of the new Esprit stores that editorial Associates has designed. Oh, I just bumped into Norman Foster. He says, we can do this. And Stan would sit down at one of those first little Macs, chomping a cigar, which is what he liked doing later in the evening. And he would just write these articles straight into the computer, blah, 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 blah. You know,
What was the frequency of Blueprint?
Monthly.
Really? Oh my God. Wow.
Yeah. And so we were making the magazine. Stephen Coates decided not to go to the Royal College of Art, come to work in the studio, which is great. And then we started doing property brochures because it was the beginning of the property boom and developers wanted a bit more. Developers knew about design and they knew that these ad agencies really didn't do a very good job. So we started doing property brochures, and quite soon, mostly because nobody else was quite there yet, my time was spent having meetings about, property brochures. And I didn't get to handle those photographs from Doug Tompkins anymore. I was too busy with, that property stuff. So that was sort of the Blueprint story. I think it's true for all these things, isn't it? You don't know, when you're doing it, you don't know, oh, this is a defining moment. You just think, well, here we go. There's Janet Abrams in New York, and Janet's got an interview with Michael Graves. That's good. Oh, Ron Arrad's coming in this afternoon. Ron's got some chair, which is an old Jaguar car seat that he wants to show us. And you do that stuff and you think, right, let's take a picture. Let's change the flat plan. Let's do this. Let's do that. And you don't really step back, do you? You're in there in the eye of the deadline and you're just trying to do what you can.
There was a gap between Blueprint and The Guardian, right? This was Esterson and
Lacastine. Blueprint predated Esterson Lacastine. So I effectively left the Architect's Journal. The last salaried job I had was in the Blueprint office doing freelance work. And then Phil Sayer put me together with Mike Lacastine, who's a proper art director. Mike at that point was the art director for a customer publishing company. And they were doing a series of beautiful magazines.
John Brown.
No, it wasn't John Brown. It's a company called Redwood.
Oh, yeah, I know Redwood.
The predecessor of John Brown. Mike had a team of art directors and the magazines were beautiful. But I think he was beginning to find that a little bit frustrating, being involved with that kind of business. And so Phil and Mike and I would have lunch occasionally, and Mike and I decided that we were going to start an editorial design business. We had a third partner, but that didn't last for very long. By that point, I'd left Blueprint and we were hunting for work, getting ready to get work. We did a few things, and then I got a phone call to have a drink with the editor and deputy editor of The Guardian.
That's good background. That leads into my question.
Sorry, I get the feeling I'm just sort of rambling in a rather useless way here.
No, we're actually controlling you like a puppet. You don't even feel it. You're falling right into our hands.
Uh-huh.
All right, Simon, this is a quote I found in our research. David Hillman's 1988 redesign of The Guardian was groundbreaking and changed the look of the paper forever. And I would imagine, sort of subconsciously, that's probably around the time many people outside of the UK actually started noticing it. Its footprint is massive. They now have a US edition, blah, blah, blah. So The Guardian is, that's probably the point at which it became something bigger than it had been.
They were launching a rival sort of upmarket daily paper called The Independent. And so The Guardian wanted to respond, and it responded by being modern. And, newspaper design, there are a few exceptions. New York Times is one of them. But newspaper design was not a world for graphic designers, really. It was a world for tweedy sub-editors. The Guardian called in Pentagram.
Right.
And David put a modernist approach to it. And that modernist approach is both the kind of the Vignelli approach, which I think we all know. Well, I certainly feel that Vignelli did fantastic design of a certain kind. Actually, I don't know how much his newspapers ever lasted or existed, but also in Europe, in Switzerland and in Germany and Italy, there were people doing kind of, range left, hang it from the rules. For goodness sake, keep the measure the same throughout the whole newspaper. But people applying magazine approaches in that way. Karl Gerstner was doing stuff in Switzerland, but The Guardian was the first one to really do it in the UK as a national newspaper. And of course, it's a left-wing newspaper. And so somehow the graphics and the content kind of fitted together.
So a decade or so later, as can happen, Hillman's design had sort of begun to slip. And you were brought in to freshen things up. I can't remember what the phrase you used, something about a new paint job or something. But let's talk about your time with The Guardian.
I was extremely lucky. Alan Rusbridger had become editor and realized that he wanted to introduce new sections and try some things with the paper. And he really wanted a design person around, not a consultant. Still, you could see the Hillman energy and tension in those, but other bits of the paper, not so much. And it's a big paper. At that point, there was a broadsheet daily, a kind of arts, culture tabloid daily, and then special tabloid sections with job ads when newspapers used to have job ads. And there was a weekend colour magazine and various other things. And Alan wanted a designer around. And with his deputy, Georgina, we had a conversation and came around to the idea that maybe I could try and do that. And I would spend half my day, most days, at The Guardian, working on live stuff with the teams there or dummying up possible future things. It was pretty hands-on, which I quite liked. It was all on ATEX, a very clumsy mainframe computer system, which we eventually managed to dispose of and replace with Macs. And at that point, it would be Quark. And once you put the Macs in, we had control over the typography. So we changed the technology, which helped. And I just really tried to get back to what I saw as the Hillman principles and add some new tools for the slightly new things we were doing, really. And then I asked Mark Porter to come in and do the weekend magazine, which was originally not part of the brief, but it was extended to include the magazine. And then when I left, Mark took over as design director. And suddenly The Guardian accepted that a design director was one of the jobs that you had. Mark then did the Berliner redesign of The Guardian, which I think is the high point of printed newspaper redesigns, best contemporary newspaper design in years.
He did the redesign that probably most people recognize now.
Mark did the redesign that went to Berliner page size, worked with Christian and Paul, a commercial type, and made, a huge type family. Mark can't set a line of type without thinking, I need a weight variation on this. So there's like 9,000 weight variations and things like that.
I've seen Guardian Egyptian. I've seen how many variations there are.
Well, yeah, it's beautiful. And then there's Guardian Sans, which is a whole other little family, which doesn't get used very much, but it's really good.
There's one variation for every citizen of India.
Pretty much, actually. Yeah. There was that thing, wasn't there, that in the future, everybody will have their own typeface. They will, but it'll just be a weight variation on Guardian Egyptian. I guess the difficulty, well, perhaps it's a measure of its success, too, of Guardian Egyptian is that you can't use it for another job. You show anybody. I showed somebody a magazine redesign that I was working on, and I said, well, of course, you can't use Guardian Egyptian for a newspaper. Nobody would do that. But I think maybe, you could use it for a magazine. And they looked at it and they said, no, you can't. It looks like The Guardian. It looks like our magazine's been taken over by The Guardian. Get rid of that typeface for us, don't we?
We'll be right back.
Print is Dead is made possible by the support of the Society of Publication Designers. The SPD powers the future of visual storytelling, setting the standard for editorial excellence and shaping the future of visual culture. For more information, visit spd.org. Simon, it sounds to me that you're really passionate about problem solving. Is there a method to your madness when you tackle a project from a design perspective? Talk a bit about your process.
I can't pretend that I do this in a terribly conscious or very effective way, but I think with a magazine, you're trying to find a graphic vocabulary for that magazine. Some of those decisions are about budget. I'm sure we've all sat in those meetings where somebody has got a magazine and they say, we want it to look like Vanity Fair. Well, and of course, we're talking about Graydon Carter's Vanity Fair, Tina Brown's Vanity Fair. We want it to look like Vanity Fair. And you think, really? Your budget is about, Annie Leibovitz's travel bill, right? Annie Leibovitz's assistant coffee bill, So you've got to be realistic about what a magazine can do financially in terms of its resources, but you're trying to find a character that works with that. I think that's what I'm trying to do most of the time. I like it when a magazine is not very good and you've been asked to make it better. Or I like it when a magazine doesn't exist. I'm not saying this has really happened to me, but when somebody comes to me and says, oh, do you want to work on this really successful magazine? You think, maybe not, because it's really successful. I'd really quite like to try and fix something up. And also, the kind of magazines I've worked for are smaller magazines, and they are largely dealing with some exceptions with existing imagery, architecture magazines. I put British Archaeology magazine on that list, which I did for a while and which I absolutely loved doing because everybody was dead, and usually there's a photograph of them buried in the ground. You were things you could do. Obviously, you can work with an illustrator, you can work with a cartoonist on some of the stuff a lot of the stuff we do, commission portraits and stuff like that. We use a lot of existing imagery, and I don't think of myself so much as an art director, more a kind of hunter-gatherer figure, working with a picture researcher. You disappear into an archive and find stuff. And I've worked for a very long time with a repro guy called John Bodkin and his team. John is a genius. It's a slightly different proposition now, but in the days when we were doing Sight and Sound, film magazine, you'd have terrible, terrible, terrible film stills. But we worked out a way of scanning them so that actually what we scanned for was the grain, not the color, and we just made them all grainy and interesting. And I enjoy doing those sort of things, like I think probably Willie Fleckhouse and Milton Glaser both saying, if you have a bad picture, just make it really, really big, like you mean it. So it's like, God, that's a really terrible picture. Right, double page spread. And the big, small picture thing. I remember probably David Hillman telling me when we were doing some layout for the Sunday Express colour magazine, well, Simon, the thing is, if you want to make a picture really big, put a really small picture next to it, do that. You look at magazines and you think, oh, that's an interesting idea. Like the double cover thing. When's that period when everybody had double covers? I think it's only Desight magazine that probably still does it. But you think, well, that's a really interesting idea. I never actually worked on a project where I thought a double cover really, really worked, was really justified. But I like that sort of development. And, Matt Willie's famous Turn It On His Side New York Times magazine about skyscrapers. So you turn it round. And that was really good. And what was really good was getting the advertisers to join in the fun and turn the ads around as well. I like that kind of stuff. When somebody says, oh, it's going to be black and white, fine. That's great. I mean, it's great. On iMagazine, we print on a 8-color Heidelberg, and it's nice having the facility to use those tools and to use those amazing machines. But I'm quite happy doing a job in black and white. You just have to think in a different way about it.
Do you prefer working on redesigns or an ongoing design?
I think it absolutely depends on the project. The tendency is the redesigns are the bigger projects, and you go and work with a team and you can say things and do things that a fully employed member of the team might hesitate about, but you're very conscious that you will be leaving at some point, that everybody will become, just as you're starting to enjoy it, everybody will become extremely fed up with your presence and wonder why you're hanging around being difficult, especially because we're not paying you. Or rather, you're not a dependent employee. You're somebody putting in these ridiculous invoices for just being difficult.
You didn't ask me, Deb, but my answer is
Right.
ongoing. I don't think I think the redesign only begins with the first issue. It doesn't.
Yeah. I mean, and isn't that the nice thing about magazines, because of frequency, monthly or weekly or whatever it is, that you get to go again? I like ongoing. There's that set of circumstances around a redesign which are enjoyable. I'm in Barcelona or I'm in Zurich and this is all quite fun. But ongoing is great. Ongoing tends to mean a smaller fee, I have to say. And ongoing tends to mean that you lay out all the pages. I mean, like all the pages. But that's fine. And the way Holly, who's my design partner, Holly and I work is that we're responsible when a project gets to a certain stage. If we're going to do it regularly, one or the other will be responsible for it, because you can't have extensive conversations with clients when there are two of you involved and messages don't get through and things get confused. So it's very simple. Holly looks after History Today, which is really a really good magazine. And I look after Museums Journal, for example, which suffers slightly because I'm looking after other things as well. But, I've been doing it today and it's fine. And I have a nice conversation with the editor about swapping out some pictures and things like that. Yeah.
We talked to Tina Brown about this a few episodes back, but in the 90s, there was this great migration of magazine talent from the UK to the US. And a lot of us in the US were like, oh no, they're going to take all of our jobs. And it was people like Tina, Harry Evans, Anna Wintour, many others. I can't remember designers, but there were designers who came over. But I'm curious.
Not as many as they were editors, I think.
Yeah, they didn't seem to bring their British designers with them. But I'm curious if you were ever tempted by an American job, and is there one that you would have left home for?
Well, it's very funny. I love the idea of an American job, just no American publishers like the idea of me having an American job.
Goes back to your marketing issue.
Well, yes, I went to New York at one point on one trip, partly because I was given an opportunity to go and see Harry Evans at Traveller. And I went to see him. We had a very, very nice conversation, but he seemed to not get the message that I wanted a job. And so I had a very nice lunch at the Thingamajig in Grand Central Station with Kath Caldwell, who was at that point the deputy art director.
The Oyster?
The Oyster Bar, yeah, that was good. It never sort of happened. Whereas, of course, Luke Heyman, who worked with us in the studio, at one point, went to America and never came back. I don't know what happened to him, but he went to America. And I've got this sort of romance about American magazines and American publishing, or at least then, the golden age, which in a way the podcast is sort of predicated on, isn't it?
So the answer is you would have left for any job.
Absolutely. At the right time, at the right age. And I would have, yeah, absolutely.
Why, I'm just curious. I've always been curious about this. Why are British art directors called art editors?
I've got no idea. And there's that whole other group of titles. What is it? Design director, creative director. I don't know what they mean.
Well, here's a quote about you. This one from Neville Brody. I have known Simon for many years. Simon is probably the most influential editorial designer in the UK that no one has ever heard of. Modest, humble, but hugely impactful, he has really helped model our editorial spaces, whether in magazines, newspapers, or online. Consummately professional and with a great eye for detail and drama, he has had a direct influence on a whole generation of designers.
And speaking of influence, many, many great talents have learned their craft from you, among them Luke Heyman, Mark Porter, Holly Catford, Stephen Coates, and Kuchar Swara, who you might know from Port. How do you think about mentorship? I mean, do you take it as a responsibility?
Not in that way. I should say that Mark Porter was Mark and I have a much more equal relationship. He was already pretty fully formed, really. No, I just have that principle that I try to, work with people who are smarter than me. As you can tell from your list, it works that way. They've all got much, much better jobs than I've got. I don't really think of it as, we've always had a small studio, so it works better to kind of, talent spot, and people come for a bit and enjoy doing editorial stuff. I think what's interesting is that balance between your ability as a designer, or a designer quality, but also that kind of diplomacy that I think particularly comes with being an editorial designer. I think it comes with being any designer, because you have to have working relationships with clients or with fellow editors. When you're working on editorial, that relationship is an ongoing one. It's not just, an annual report you have to get agreement on. We've got to work on this week to week. And it's very noticeable. And people like John Hill is the most diplomatic designer, the most masterful diplomatic designer I've ever worked with. Quite remarkable to watch John, kind of engineering a situation.
I think that really is the trait, though. That's the secret weapon. I credit my mentor with that, too. That ability to, I want to say handle a client, but to be able to manage that relationship in a way that is unemotional, understands the priority, understands the work that needs to get done. And presumably this is something they've all learned from you because they've made it as far as they have.
I'm not sure they have. I think John knows more about diplomacy than I ever will. I do have a sort of tolerance point, and occasionally on a project I will step over my tolerance point, and I've been known to be heard shouting down the phone at people about things.
Oh, interesting. Might be fun.
Simon, you've done so many magazines in your career. Which one stands out to you?
That's like the "what's your favorite child" question,
Yes,
isn't it?
I know.
Okay. What's your
But
favorite?
it could be because you're proud of the design or you loved a particular partnership.
Well, I've been really lucky. Apart from designers I've worked with some great editors, Dan Sujic on Blueprint and Domus in Italy, John Walters on I magazine. I think there are some magazines that, I mean, I'm intensely proud of I magazine, of course. John and I own it between us. If we weren't proud of it, it'd be pretty bad because we're sort of responsible for the way it looks and the way it is. I have a soft spot for British Archaeology magazine because it's not material that normally you're allowed to handle in an editorial magazine-y way. I had a couple of, tolerant editors until it eventually came to the point where I think the feeling was that my layouts were big on graphics and rather small on archaeology. And okay, so at that point you have to get rid of the art editor, right? That's fine. There are a lot of magazines and they're all pretty, apart from a couple of things, they're all pretty small magazines. And I guess that's what I've gravitated towards, a small magazine where one can be really involved. Whereas, I've done stuff with the Sunday Times and big organizations like that. It's much more complicated to do something really powerful. Too many people have to kind of agree.
So is there one that makes you cringe or you don't want to answer that?
I don't want to answer it. I don't even want to think about it.
Okay, that's fair. It's dead to you.
What's the most annoying request you've ever gotten from a client?
Well, I think that the most worrying signal is that we want it to look like Vanity Fair conversation. That's the moment that I usually know this job is not perhaps going to end. Unless they suddenly have got the budget, this is not going to end well. I think I've got a sort of, sorry, this seems really self-indulgent, doesn't it, that you ask. When somebody sends you a sketch of what a layout should look like, that's usually the point that I kind of work out when we can do the last invoice and how soon we can go out of this one. I mean, I completely like a porous relationship. So if John Walters has a strong view about how this should be laid out for editorial reasons, that's great. And sometimes I have a strong view about what a headline should be or not be because of what we want to do with it graphically or something. That's a relationship, right? And if editors and art editors and journalists all agreed about everything at the same time, it would be really boring, wouldn't it? You need that tension. Two people who recognize that they each bring things to the discussion. But when somebody basically thinks they know how to design something, that's fine. They can do it, but I'm not going to do it for them, That's my sort of little point. It's when somebody slightly wants to impose their view on a particular graphic presentation.
It's possible we've already covered this, and then maybe I'm just asking a question a different way, but I do want to ask it. So I think all three of us share a passion for hands-on design, which can often be incompatible with high-profile jobs where so much more is expected from the creative director. While you have worked for a few brand names, much of your more recent work has been with smaller publishers. Can you talk a little bit about the choices you've made and maybe the satisfaction that comes from the clients that you do choose to work with?
I don't think I'm a very good big organization person. I like that relationship of going in to do, a consultancy process because I think everybody sort of knows that this will come to an end and it's a rather defined relationship. Big organizations, yeah, they just worry me slightly. I've got so used to kind of, if I want to use a particular printer or I want to use a particular repro house or even I want to use a particular typeface and somebody says, oh, that typeface isn't on our licensed group of typefaces, well, okay. I may be completely wrong and naive about this, but I think you work for a big organization. You can both tell me you both work or have worked for big organizations. I think you trade your freedom of action for the access to massive resources. Whereas on a smaller publication, you have a lot more theoretical freedom of action, but the range of resources you can use is much more limited, and you have to sometimes work quite hard to preserve them.
It's a test of a good art director, though.
Yeah.
I think that's fair.
But then sometimes you see things that the New York Times magazine does, or the Sunday Times magazine used to do, and you think, shit, only they could get access. This is completely from thin air, but a few years ago, there was that New York Times magazine shoot of, was it Obama's cabinet? All those senior...
All of the black and white portraits.
Yeah. Or indeed, there's that issue of years ago of Rolling Stone with those Avden pictures of great Americans or something, or that...
Our issue.
That's the one. Or that famous New York magazine cover with the Bill Cosby victims. That's about having picture teams and research teams and all that kind of thing, isn't it? I mean, they're great, ambitious editorial things. And I think that's great. And I think that comes from being a big organization. But, both these things are interesting. I've just ended up working in kind of smaller, hopefully feistier things.
All right, well, we've made it to the billion-dollar question. I should have a jingle that introduces this thing.
Yes, you should.
All right, so an anonymous billionaire wants to give you a blank check with one caveat. You must use it to create and launch a print magazine. So what will you make?
Well, like any good designer, I just want to explore the edges of this brief here, just to define what we're talking about. Because I think it's two things. I mean, one, I already have that with John Walters. I already have that magazine. I have iMagazine. And we have to work quite hard to keep it going. And we all have to do lots of jobs. Sorry, this sounds like a sob story, doesn't it? But, a check for a large sum of money would really help that. But that's an already existing magazine. Maybe that doesn't count. My new one is it's like a magazine, but it's also a sort of magazine incubator hub. So what we're going to do is have a magazine that is about spawning other magazines. And we have a kind of group of people who make magazines for people who want a magazine. They've got something to say. I think that's a basic requirement of a good magazine, that the people have to have something to say. We make a magazine for people who have something to say, but not necessarily the access to the means to do it. It would be like a building, and we'd be making magazines about all sorts of different things all day. If somebody wants to make a magazine about, I don't know, how eating sugar, liking chocolate has made you a sort of public pariah in the way that it used to be when people smoked, let's make a magazine about that. I'd like the idea of being a kind of vehicle to explore ideas, all sorts of ideas, and we had the money to have a team and the ability to do that. Sorry, does that sound like a really pathetic cop-out?
No, it sounds like a big, massive publishing company.
Exactly, a big, massive publishing company with that all-important profit motive taken away, so we don't have to have lots of middle managers who talk about projected revenues and stuff like that.
And it's uncensored.
It's uncensored, yes, because that's a whole discussion itself, isn't it? About the act of publishing when you acknowledge that what you're publishing is just one view of the situation.
For more on this and all of our episodes, visit our website where, in addition to complete transcripts of all our interviews, along with portfolios, archival photos, links, and other great information on our guests, you'll find our blog, Entry Points, about all things magazine, and our ever-expanding swag shop with all kinds of great custom merch. You can also support the podcast by clicking the adorable yellow button at the top of the page, all available at magazium.co.
Print is Dead, Long Live Print is a member of the Hub and Spoke Audio Collective, a nonprofit association of audio storytellers dedicated to promoting and sustaining high-quality, independent podcasting. Learn more at hubspokeaudio.org.
Magazium is made possible by the generous support of listeners like you. If you love our shows and can't wait for new episodes, or even if you just listen from time to time and love knowing we're here, please consider making a donation to help keep us going. Visit magazium.co/support.
Print is Dead, Long Live Print is a production of Magazium, LLC. For more information, visit our website, magazium.co, or follow us on social media at magazium.co. Please give us a like and a review on your favorite podcast app. It really helps. Thanks very much for listening.